The sun was a merciless white eye, baking the New Mexico territory into a cracked brown floor. For 3 weeks, Elias Washington had tasted nothing but the grit kicked up by 3,000 head of cattle. He was here because Jedediah Grizz Barlow, the trail boss, had been 2 men short in Santa Fe, and Elias was the only one desperate enough to take the wage. "I'm hiring your arms, not your company," Grizz had said, his voice like gravel in a dry creek bed. He'd looked past Elias, not at him, as he spoke. "You'll eat last, you'll ride drag, and you'll keep your mouth shut. You're worthless to me, but you're a body. Don't you forget it." Elias hadn't forgotten. Riding drag wasn't just a position, it was a punishment. It was a constant choking cloud of alkaline dust and biting flies. A haze so thick he could barely see the man riding flank 50 yards ahead. Up front, he could sometimes hear the faint, sharp bark of laughter from the other hands. Cooper, Shorty, the kid they called Red. To them, Elias was a ghost on a horse, a dark shape in the swirling grit. The silence from the other men was a wall, as high and hard as the distant mountains. The moment that defined him came on the 10th day. A wild-eyed longhorn, thin and fast as a whip, broke from the herd. It bolted for a dense thicket of mesquite, and Grizz bellowed, "Cooper! Red! Box him in!" Red's loop went wide, snagging on a prickly pear. Cooper spurred his horse, but the steer was too quick, juking left with a toss of its horns. Elias didn't wait for an order. He was already moving. His bay mare, a quiet animal that understood the subtle shift of his weight, cut the angle. The rope was a living thing in his hands, a blur of braided hemp that seemed to think for itself. It shot out, not in a wide, hopeful loop, but in a fast, tight circle that snapped open at the last second. It wasn't aimed at the head. It was a perfect, whistling throw that settled clean over the steer's back heels. Elias dallied the rope to his horn, and his mare planted her feet, leaning back on her haunches. The steer was flipped, clean and sudden, landing with a baffled whoosh of air that kicked up its own cloud of dust. Elias had the steer tied and hobbled before Cooper even got close. Elias trotted back, coiling his rope, the fire of the throw already gone from his veins. The other men were silent, watching. Grizz rode up, his face grim. He spat a stream of tobacco that landed inches from Elias's boot. "Took you long enough, boy," Grizz sneered, his eyes scanning the horizon as if Elias wasn't there. He turned to Red. "See that? Even a blind hog finds an acorn now and then. Don't mean he's a hunter. Now get that animal back in line before you lose another one." Grizz rode off, leaving the credit to hang in the air, unclaimed and spoiled. Elias tipped his hat to no one and turned his horse to fall back into the suffocating dust. The shame of the moment, the casual theft of his skill, burned hotter than the sun. He kept his eyes down, fixed on the sea of brown, churning hides. That's when he saw her. Ilara Barlow, Grizz's daughter, was riding near the chuck wagon, her face smudged with dust. She was maybe 20, with her father's iron in her spine, but none of his poison. She had seen the whole thing, the chase, the perfect throw, and her father's casual dismissal. Her eyes met his across the 30 yards of chaos. She didn't smile, but she gave him a short, respectful nod. A simple, sharp acknowledgement. "I saw you. I know what you did." Elias's heart kicked once, hard. He wanted to return the nod, to show he'd seen her too, but he could feel Grizz's gaze on the back of his neck. Any connection, even as one as small as a look, was a danger. He broke eye contact, turning his face back to the choking cloud, the nod he'd received, a a tiny bright ember, cupped in his chest. The trail was hard, but the land's greatest test was always the water. They came to the Rio Puerco at midday, and it was not a river. It was a thick, muscular artery of mud-brown water, swollen with melted snow from the high country. It moved fast, carrying a lethal cargo of broken branches and tangled roots. Grizz rode his horse along the bank, his face a thundercloud. A safer, wider crossing lay a mile south, but a mile south was 2 hours lost. "We ain't got time to baby 'em," Grizz roared over the sound of the water. "This is where we cross. Narrow as fast. Push 'em in!" The lead steers balked, their hooves sinking into the sucking mud at the bank. The hands started yelling, their ropes cracking, forcing the terrified animals into the cold rush. The herd, pressed from behind, became a logjam of horns and panicked, lowing cattle. It was on the far side of the mess that a small, white-faced calf, separated from its mother, was struck by a heavy piece of driftwood. It was knocked off its feet and swept into the main current. The mother cow bellowed, a desperate, heart-ripping sound, but she was trapped in the mass of the herd. "Leave it!" Grizz yelled. He was on the near bank, his face purple with the effort of his shouting. "It's one head! We'll lose more if we break formation! Keep 'em moving!" The other hands did as they were told, turning their horses to put pressure on the herd, their faces hard. Elias at the drag watched the calf's small head go under, then reappear struggling. He saw the pure panic in its black eyes as it was swept toward a snag of broken trees. He didn't wait. He didn't ask. He was off his bay mare in a flash, his boots hitting the mud. He heard Grizz scream his name, "Washington, you worthless!" But the sound was cut off by the river's roar. The water was a physical blow, ice-cold and strong as a fist. It tore his hat from his head and sucked at his legs. He wasn't swimming. He was fighting, pulling himself through the debris-filled water toward the snag. The calf was tangled, its leg caught in a sunken branch. Elias reached it just as its head went under again. He pulled his knife, a simple, worn tool, and dove into the murky brown, cutting at the branch he couldn't see. His lungs burned. He felt the branch give, and he surfaced, gasping, grabbing a fistful of hide. He kicked, shoving the terrified animal, pushing it free of the main current and toward the muddy safety of the bank. He fell onto the shore, shoving the calf onto the grass where it lay, trembling and sputtering. The entire outfit had stopped to watch. The only sound was the rush of the river and the panting of the calf. Grizz rode his horse across the now shallowed ford, stopping right in front of Elias. His shadow fell over him like a judgment. "Well," Grizz said quietly, which was far more dangerous than his yell, "ain't that a show?" Elias looked up, his chest heaving. "You think this is a theater, boy? You think we all stopped our day to watch you play the hero in the water? You think you're better than my orders?" "The calf was trapped, sir," Elias said, his voice raspy. "I gave an order," Grizz bellowed, and now the other hands looked away, studying their saddle horns. "You put the whole herd at risk for one scrawny animal. You trying to show me up? Is that it? You think that little rope trick the other day made you a man?" He leaned down from his saddle. "You're docked a day's pay, and you're lucky it ain't your hide. Now get back on your horse and get to the drag before I leave you here." Elias watched him ride off. He got to his feet, the cold mud pulling at him, every muscle screaming in protest. He glanced across the water, just once. Ilara was there, her face pale, her hands clenched so tightly on her reins that her knuckles were white. She watched him, her expression a mixture of awe and a deep burning shame. Elias retrieved his horse and fell back into his place, the drag, letting the dust settle on his wet clothes, the isolation colder than the river had been.
Night came, and with it a chill that cut straight through his still damp jacket. The fire had burned down to a bed of winking coals. The camp was asleep, the other hands a ring of dark, blanketed shapes. Elias sat apart from them, as always, his back against his saddle near his horse. He hadn't eaten. His hands were raw, the rope burns from the steer and the cold, wet work at the river turning his palms into a map of red, stinging pain. He was trying to rub some life back into his fingers when he heard a sound. A single, soft footstep on the dry grass. His hand went to the knife at his belt. "Who's there?" he whispered. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness by the chuck wagon. "Shh, it's just me. Elora." He was on his feet in an instant, his wariness battling his surprise. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be here. If your father—" "I know," she said, her voice a low whisper. She stepped closer, and he could see she was carrying a tin mug and a small dark-colored jar. "He's asleep. They all are." She held out the mug. "It's coffee. I kept it warm by the coals." He hesitated. She pushed it toward him. "Take it. You're half frozen." He took the mug, his raw fingers brushing hers. The jolt was so unexpected, so warm, it was almost painful. Then she held up the small jar. "This is for your hands," she said. It was my mother's recipe, for burns and chapped skin. It helps." He stared at the jar, then at her face, barely visible in the starlight. "Ma'am, why?" Alara looked down, then back up, and her eyes were fierce. "I saw what you did today, at the river." He looked away, the shame of the berating still fresh. "Just a calf, ma'am." "No," she said, and her voice was so sharp it made him look back. "It wasn't just a calf. It was right. It was the only right thing that happened all day. My father, he was wrong." The words hung in the cold night air. Someone had sided with him. Someone had seen him, not as a ghost, not as boy, but as a man who had done right. The wall of silence he'd lived in for weeks suddenly had a door. He had no words. He just looked at her, and she at him. In that moment, they were the only two people awake in the entire vast territory. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered. She had used his name. He started, his throat thick. "Thank you, ma'am, for this." He held up the mug. She gave him a small, sad smile. "Good night." "Good night, ma'am." She was gone as quickly as she'd come, a shadow melting back into the darkness. Elias stood there for a long time, the tin mug warming his aching hands. He finally took a sip. The coffee was black, scalding and laced with chicory, but it was the warmest thing he'd ever tasted. He sat down, uncorked the small jar, and breathed in the sharp, clean scent of pine and beeswax. As he worked the cool salve into his torn skin, the sting began to fade, replaced by a different kind of ache, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee, and everything to do with the girl who'd walked through the dark to find him.
The 2 weeks that followed the river crossing were a silent, simmering war. The bond formed in the dark by the chuck wagon lived in the daylight as stolen glances. Elias would be at the drag, his face a mask of dust, and he'd see Elara watching him from beside the wagon. She'd look away, then look back, a silent, steady acknowledgement that passed between them like a current. Grizz saw it. He saw the way his daughter's eyes lingered on the man in the drag. He saw the way she no longer joined in the casual mockery of the other hands. He didn't know about the coffee or the salve, but he knew respect when he saw it, and the sight of it directed at Elias was a stone in his boot. His orders to Elias became sharper, his voice laced with a possessive venom that made the other cowboys trade nervous looks. Then they entered the Malpais, the Badlands. The world of green grass and muddy rivers vanished, replaced by a 40-mile stretch of volcanic rock and sun-baked alkali flats. The pass was a gash in the earth, a canyon where the walls rose up on either side, trapping the heat. The sun was no longer a light. It was a hammer, pounding the cracked earth. The only sound was the click-clack of thousands of hooves on stone and the dry hiss of the wind. The herd, which had been restless, now grew miserable. The weaker cattle began to lag, their tongues lolling. The lowing of the herd changed from a simple trail noise to a low, desperate chorus of thirst. By the second day in the pass, the water barrels on the chuck wagon were running low, and the next river was still a day's ride away. "They need to rest, boss," Cooper, the lead hand, said, wiping the sweat from his neck. "They're getting spooky. They can smell the dry." "They'll rest when I say they rest," Grizz snapped, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. He saw the pass as a personal insult, a challenge to his will. Push 'em till they drop, then push 'em some more. We'll be out of this hell ditch by sundown." From his place at the drag, Elias felt it first. It wasn't a wind, it was a change in the air itself. The dead, dry heat was replaced by a heavy, humid stillness. The hair on his arms pricked up. He looked west to the high wall of the canyon. Above it, the sky was no longer a perfect empty blue. A dark purple mass, the color of a fresh bruise, was silently climbing the horizon. He saw the cattle feel it too. Their heads came up, they stopped their miserable lowing, and a new sound began. A nervous clatter of horns as they jostled, their eyes rolling white. This wasn't thirst anymore. This was fear. Elias knew he had to speak.
He spurred his mare, riding out of the choking dust, past the flankers, past the swing riders. The other hands watched him go, their faces a mix of scorn and curiosity. He rode all the way to the front, pulling up alongside Grizz, who was riding next to Alara. Grizz turned, his face darkening with rage at the sight of Elias daring to join the point. "What in the hell do you think you're doing, Washington? Your place is in the dust." "Boss," Elias said, his voice low and steady, ignoring the insult. He pointed with his chin to the west. "Look at the sky. That storm's coming fast, and this herd is tender. If we're in this pass when it hits, with these walls—" He didn't need to finish. A stampede in a narrow canyon was a death sentence. There was a box canyon about a mile back. We could shelter the herd. Grizz stared at the sky for a long, hard second. He saw the purple, but his pride was a blinder. He looked at Alara, who was watching Elias with a look of desperate, trusting agreement. That look sealed it. Grizz laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You a weatherman now, boy, on top of a cattle nurse? That's heat, not a storm. You're just looking for an excuse to quit work." "Sir, that ain't heat," Elias pushed, his voice urgent. "I can smell the ozone. Listen to the cattle, they know." "You listen to me," Grizz said, leaning over in his saddle, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "I am the boss of this drive, not you. I say we push. You're paid to keep 'em moving, not to think. You ever ride up here again, I'll count it as you trying to take my job. You understand me?" Alara spoke, her voice small but clear. "Father, he's right. The air feels—" "Quiet, Alara," Grizz roared, turning on her. "I won't have you question me, and I sure as hell won't be questioned by him." He wheeled his horse back to Elias. "Get back to the drag." Elias held Grizz's gaze for one long, cold moment. There was no winning. He gave a single, tight nod. He turned his mare and rode back, past the silent, watching cowboys, into the cloud of his own isolation.
He got to the back, and the air was thicker now, so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. The purple bruise in the sky had swallowed the sun. Up front, Grizz bellowed, "Full push! I want out of this canyon now!" Elias looked at the terrified herd in front of him and the dark, boiling sky above him. He pulled his hat down low, loosened the rope on his saddle, and said a quiet prayer. The trap was set. Grizz had just slammed the door.
Grizz's order to push was the last clear sound anyone heard. The world went still, as if the pass were a vacuum. The air, thick and yellow, became impossible to breathe. The purple mass in the sky boiled over the canyon rim and swallowed the sun whole, plunging the trail into an unnatural, terrifying twilight. And then the first drop of rain hit. It was not a drizzle. It was a single, heavy thump on the brim of Elias's hat, as loud as a thrown stone. It was followed by another, and another. Then the sky didn't just open, it tore. A sheet of hail and ice-cold rain hammered the herd. A bolt of lightning, jagged and blue-white, didn't just flash, it struck the canyon wall, not 50 feet from the lead steers. The sound was not a rumble. It was a single, deafening crack, like the world's biggest whip. A sound so sharp it felt like it split the air itself. The herd detonated. It wasn't a run. It was an explosion. The 3,000 head of cattle, already maddened by thirst and fear, surged as one entity. The ground itself, which had been clicking with hooves, became a low, continuous roar, like a train passing inches from your ear. "Point! Turn 'em!" Grizz was screaming, his face a mask of rain and panic. "To the point! Turn 'em left!" But his voice was a mosquito in a hurricane. It was gone, stolen by the wind. Cooper and Red up front were white-faced. They weren't cowboys anymore. They were just men clinging to their saddles, their horses spinning in terror. They were swallowed by the wave, their attempts to turn the lead steers utterly futile. The herd was a living avalanche of horn and hide, and it had only one direction, forward, into the narrowest, most treacherous part of the pass. At the drag, Elias saw it coming. He didn't fight. You knew you couldn't fight an avalanche. He turned his bay mare, letting the wave of panic hit him, herding him along with the cattle. He spurred his horse not against the tide, but with it, fighting his way to the outside edge, the safe zone, where he could at least try to put pressure on the flank to keep the whole mass from grinding itself to death against the canyon walls. He was no longer a man. He was a piece of driftwood in a flood. Up front, Grizz had forgotten the herd. He was screaming at his daughter. "Ilara, stay with me, girl! Ride!" He had pushed them into this. His pride, his refusal to listen, had led them here. And now his daughter was in the thick of it. A huge steer, blinded by the rain, its eyes white with terror, slammed broadside into Ilara's horse. The mare, already dancing on the edge of panic, reared up, her hooves slashing at the sky, a high-pitched scream of pure animal terror ripping from her throat. Ilara, a skilled rider, held on for a second, fighting for balance, but the saddle was slick with rain and hail. She was thrown. She landed hard. Not in the mud, but on a jagged shelf of the black, volcanic rock that lined the pass. The world went white. She felt the snap in her left leg before she even registered the pain. It was a sick, wet pop, a feeling of disconnection that was more terrifying than the stampede. She tried to push herself up, to crawl. "Father!" she screamed, but her voice was a whisper in the roar. Her leg folded under her, useless. And then the pain hit. It was a white-hot, blinding fire that shot from her ankle all the way to her hip. She fell back, gasping, her vision blurring. Through the curtain of rain and her own tears of agony, she looked up. She couldn't see her father. She couldn't see the other hands. She could only see the herd. It was no longer a collection of animals. It was a solid, thundering wall of bodies, a sea of pointed horns and rolling eyes, 10,000 pounds of blind panic. And it was coming right for her.
Grizz saw it all. He saw the steer hit. He saw the mare rear, and he saw his daughter's body hit the rock. A sound tore from his throat, a sound that wasn't a word, just a raw animal bellow of pure, undiluted terror. "Elara!" He spurred his horse, trying to cut through the herd to get to her, but the stampede was a solid wall of thundering beef. A massive steer slammed into his own mount, nearly unseating him and forcing him back. He was 10 yards away, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles. He pulled his horse to a stop, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. He was Jedediah Grizz Barlow. He commanded men. He broke cattle. He bent the world to his will with the sheer force of his rage. But he couldn't stop this. He was just a man on a horse, watching his only child about to be erased from the earth. The power he'd built his entire life on was a joke. His orders were wind. His position was meaningless. He was, in this one terrible moment, utterly and completely helpless. He watched the lead steers, their heads down, their eyes blind with rain and panic, closing the distance to the small broken shape on the rocks. 50 feet, 40 feet. He screamed her name again, a useless, pathetic sound. Then, through the gray sheet of rain, he saw movement. A horse and rider, not fighting the herd, but using it. A dark shape moving with impossible speed on the far flank. It was Elias Washington. Grizz's mind, frozen in terror, took a single sharp second to process what he was seeing. Elias wasn't panicked. He wasn't screaming. He was low in the saddle, her bay mare moving in perfect, controlled strides, herding the panic itself. Grizz watched as Elias, riding low and fast, was not looking at Grizz, not even looking at Elara. He was looking ahead of her. His gaze was fixed on the lead steer, a massive one-horned beast that was guiding the entire wave. Elias was already in motion. He was already calculating the angle. He was already acting. In that split second, everything Grizz believed in shattered. The man he'd scorned, the man he'd called worthless, the boy he'd exiled to the dust. That man was the only one in the entire territory who had a chance. The only one who might be fast enough, might be skilled enough, might even be willing. All the hate, the pride, the racism, it was all burned away by the white-hot terror for his daughter. He didn't have time to ask. He had time to beg. He raised his arm, a useless, desperate gesture against the storm. He screamed, not as a boss, but as a father, his voice ripping through his own throat. "Elias!" Across the chaos, Elias's head snapped around, his eyes dark and focused, locked with Grizz's. "Save my daughter!" Grizz shrieked, his face a mask of pleading, desperate madness. He pointed with a shaking hand, not at Elara, but at Elias. "Save her! Save my daughter, and the herd is yours!"
Elias heard the words, but they were distant, unimportant. The offer of the herd, the plea from the man who hated him, it was all just noise in the storm. He'd been in motion before the first word left Grizz's lips. His world had shrunk to a few critical elements. The bay mare beneath him, the slick leather of the reins, the distance to the one-horned steer, and the small, still shape on the rocks. Grizz's offer didn't matter. Ilara's nod mattered. Her quiet kindness in the dark mattered. The law of the trail, that you don't leave anyone behind, mattered.
He was no longer riding drag. He was the point. His mare, sensing the change, ran with a fire he'd never felt from her before. She was a dark arrow loosed into the heart of the chaos. They didn't run from the stampede. They ran alongside it, so close that the hot, wet breath of the nearest cattle fogged the air around them. The roar was a physical thing, a vibration that came up from the soles of his boots and rattled the teeth in his skull. Horns, slick with rain, flashed inches from his leg. To the other cowboys, huddled and helpless, it looked like suicide. He was riding into the grinding, crushing heart of the herd. But Elias wasn't looking at the chaos. He was looking at the cause. The one-horned lead steer. In a stampede, the herd becomes a single organism with a single brain, and that brain was inside the skull of that one animal. Turn him, and you turn the flood. He was closing the distance. 20 feet. 15. He couldn't get in front of it. That was death. He had to make the steer choose to turn. His hand moved, a blur of practiced motion. It didn't go for his rope. It went for the Colt pistol holstered at his hip. He drew the gun, the worn metal, a cold, familiar weight in his hand. Red, watching from a safe distance, thought he'd gone mad. He's going to shoot it? He'll make it worse. But Elias didn't aim at the animal. He aimed 20 feet in front of it, at a flat, dark slab of volcanic rock on the canyon floor. He fired. The shot was a single sharp crack that somehow cut through the deeper roar of the herd. The bullet didn't whine. It hit the rock and spalled, sending a puff of gray dust and a spray of stone chips directly into the path of the one-horned steer. To the animal, in its blind panic, it was a snake striking from the ground, a sudden, inexplicable threat from a direction it wasn't expecting. The steer reacted instantly. It flinched, tossing its head, its momentum broken for a single, crucial half-second. It veered hard to the left, away from the perceived danger, seeking open ground. And because it turned, the 10 steers directly behind it turned, and the 50 behind them turned. The entire front wave of the stampede, the deadliest part, shifted its course. The herd split. It was like a miracle. The thundering wall of beef peeled away from Alara, a river of brown and black diverting around a single fragile stone. The edge of the herd passed so close to her that the wind from its passage stirred her hair, but it did not touch her. The immediate danger was over, but she was still in the middle of a churning chaos of terrified animals. Elias holstered his pistol without looking. His work wasn't done. He spurred his mare, cutting through the gap he'd just created. He reached Alara's side and vaulted from the saddle before his horse had even come to a full stop. "Alara," he said, his voice low but urgent, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open. They were glazed with pain. "My leg," she whispered, her teeth chattering from shock and cold. "I know. I'm going to get you out of here," he said. He touched her shoulder gently. "This is going to hurt." He didn't wait for a reply. In one smooth, powerful motion, he scooped her up. Her cry of pain was a knife in his gut, but he held her tight against his chest, shielding her body with his own. He swung back into the saddle, his mare standing like a rock amidst the swirling, panicked cattle. Then he turned for Grizz. The ride back was a different kind of miracle. The storm was already lessening, the hail turning to a hard, driving rain. The roar of the stampede was fading as the herd thundered down the canyon, away from them. In its place was a stunned, ringing silence. Cooper, Red, Shorty, the other hands. They just sat on their horses, their mouths agape, slickers dripping. They had just witnessed something impossible,
They hadn't seen a desperate act. They had seen a master at his craft, a man who could read a stampede like a book and rewrite the ending. The scorn on their faces was gone, replaced by a look of raw, unadulterated awe. Elias rode through the quiet, his face a mask of calm focus. He held Alara with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man who had just faced down 3,000 stampeding cattle. He pulled up in front of Grizz, whose face was a ruin of terror, relief, and utter disbelief. Elias looked down at the man who had called him worthless. He didn't say a word. He just held out his arms, offering the trail boss's daughter back to him.
As if Elias's act of heroism had broken the spell, the storm broke. The hammering rain softened to a steady, clean drizzle. The wind died with a final mournful sigh, and the oppressive yellow-gray sky began to brighten, revealing a washed-out blue. The roar of the stampede was now a distant, fading thunder. In the sudden, ringing silence, the only sound was Elias's pained, quiet breathing. Grizz, his face a ruin of terror and relief, stumbled forward. He reached out, his hands trembling, not like the hands of a trail boss, but like the hands of an old man. Elias leaned down from the saddle, and with that same impossible gentleness, transferred Eliasa from his arms into her father's. Grizz clutched his daughter to his chest, his eyes squeezing shut. A dry, ragged sob tore from his throat. "My girl! My girl!" Elias's hand found his neck. I'm cold, Papa." "I know, baby. I know," Grizz whispered, his voice broken. Elias sat on his horse, watching, his face calm. He was about to turn his mare to go help round up the scattered herd, but Grizz's voice stopped him. "Wait." Grizz, still holding Eliasa, looked up at Elias. His eyes were red-rimmed and raw. He had no words. Not yet. Instead, he fumbled with the strap on his saddle horn. He unhooked his own personal canteen, the one that wasn't for the crew, the one that held his private stock of water. He held it up to Elias. It was a gesture so profound, so steeped in the code of the West, that the other hands, Cooper, Red, Shorty, who were now gathering in a loose, stunned circle, all took a half-step back. They were witnessing the unmaking and remaking of a man. Elias looked at the canteen, then at Grizz's eyes. He took it, uncapped it, and took a long, slow drink. He capped it and handed it back. Mr. Washington, and the name, the Mr., hit the air with the force of a gunshot. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke again his voice was loud enough for every man to hear. He was looking right at Elias. "I was wrong," he said, the words costing him everything and, in the same breath, setting him free. "I was a fool, a blind, hateful fool." He looked at Eliasa, then back at Elias. "I made a promise. The herd is yours. I'll sign the bill of sale in Dodge City. It's yours." Elias just nodded, his expression unreadable.
"But more than that," Grizz said, his voice thick. "You have my thanks. You saved my blood. I won't ever forget it." 2 weeks later, in a dusty office at the Dodge City stockyards, the deal was done. Grizz sat at a table, Alara beside him in a wooden chair, her legs splinted and propped up on a stool. Grizz signed his name with a flourish to the bill of sale and slid it across the table to Elias. 3,000 head, minus the 50 we lost in the pass. Signed, sealed, and paid. Elias took the paper, folded it, and put it in his breast pocket. "What will you do now, Mr. Washington?" Grizz asked, his voice quiet, respectful. "I know some land in Arizona," Elias said, looking at the paper, then at Alara. "Good water, plenty of grass. Good place to start a spread." Alara, who had been watching Elias with a look of open admiration, smiled. "It's a lot of work for one man, Mr. Washington. You'll need a good partner." Elias's stern, trail-worn face finally broke into a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes. I believe I've already found one, ma'am. If she's willing to take the job. Elara's smile matched his. I am. 6 months later, the sun was not a white eye, but a warm, golden hand on a valley of green, high-country grass. On the porch of a newly built log cabin, Elias Washington stood, one arm around Elara's waist. Below them, their herd, grazed peacefully, fat and content by a wide, clear-running stream. Look at that, Elias said, his voice a low, happy rumble. All that worthless. Elara leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand coming up to rest on his. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Elias. He kissed the top of her head, and they stood together, watching the sun set on their future, a future built not on the name they were called, but on the worth they had proven. Thank you for listening to this story from Black Lives Story. Elias's journey reminds us that a person's worth is not defined by the prejudice of others, but by their own courage, their own skill, and their own heart. Even in the face of hatred, a single act of bravery and kindness can change everything. If you were moved by Elias and Elara's story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Share this tale with someone who needs to be reminded that hope can be found in the most desperate of places. Your support helps us to keep telling these powerful stories. We'll see you in the next one.